Bud, Not Buddy, Chapter 11, Part 1. The car only went 30 giant steps before it commenced to bucking and finally cutting right off. The vampire guy finally caught up with me. He was looking very surprised. He just tapped on the window with his knuckle and said, "Roll the window down for a minute, Bud." Sometimes it's terrible to have been brought up proper. I couldn't help myself. I rolled the window down far enough that our words could get in and out, but his hand or claws couldn't. He said, "Okay, what's this?" I said, "Don't you think I can read? How come you're carrying real human blood in your car?" I showed him my jackknife. "I'm gonna warn you, I know how to kill vampires. This knife is genuine solid 24 karat silver." He put both of his hands over his face and shook his head back and forth a couple of times, and he said, "Sweet baby Jesus, why me?" Then he said, "Bud, if you were from Flint, I might believe that. But if you were from Flint, I might think you believe that. But you're a Grand Rapids boy. You've got to be smarter than that. If I was a vampire, why would I have got that sandwich and bottle of red pop?" I thought for a second, and then the answer jumped out. Bait. He put his hands over his face. This time when he pulled them away, he was laughing, and he said, "Bud, if I was a vampire, I wouldn't have to catch little boys. I'd just stick my fangs into one of those bottles and have my supper. Besides, where have you ever heard of a vampire that knew how to drive a car?" Now that made sense. In all the movie picture shows I'd seen and all the books I'd read about vampires, I never could think of seeing one that could drive a car. But I wasn't going to take any chances. "Could I see your teeth, sir?" "What?" "Your teeth, sir." The man mumbled something, shook his head again, then leaned close to the window glass and opened his mouth. Even though he didn't have fangs, his teeth still looked kind of scary. They looked like they could bite a pretty good grapefruit-sized chunk out of you. Then he said, "Bud, I've got to get this blood to Hurley Hospital in Flint. They need it right away for someone's operation. I can look at you and tell you're far too smart to believe in any nonsense like vampires, son. Be a good boy and open the door." I pulled the lock up for him and scooted over to the passenger side of the car. I unlocked my door just in case he had any tricks up his sleeve. He got in the car and said, "You'll never know how grateful I am to you, Bud. I'll take the horrible image of you putting my car in gear to drive while I stood by the side of the road in Owasso, Michigan, at 2:30 in the morning to my grave with me. Thank God you don't know how to drive." "No, sir. But if you kind of showed me some fangs, I'd learn real quick." Just in case, I watched the way he put the car in gear, so next time something like this happened, I would know how to make a clean getaway. Me and the man headed back toward Flint, driving over the same road it took me so long to walk. Going like this, I wasn't ever going to get away from this doggone city. We hadn't been driving for a minute before he started asking a whole slew of questions I had to be careful about giving the right answers to. He said, "Don't feel bad about worrying your mother like this, Bud Not Buddy. My mother is dead, sir. Most times if you tell an adult that, they'll just leave you alone, but not this man." "What?" "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Bud. So you stay with your daddy?" "Yes, sir." "Right in Grand Rapids?" "Yes, sir." "What's his name? Does he work for the railroad?" "No, sir." The seed started sticking its head out further and further. "His name is Herman E. Calloway, and he plays the biggest doggone fiddle you'll ever see." The man shouted, "What?" I said, "Really, sir, I swear for God, it's the biggest fiddle in the world." He said, "I know your father. Everybody in Grand Rapids does." I didn't say anything. He said, "Well, I'll be. You know, at first glimpse, I wouldn't say you look much like Herman, but now that I look at you, I suppose you do. Of course, he's quite a lot bigger, if you know what I mean." That was the best news I had heard all day. My face nearly split in half from my giant smile. "Yes, sir, folks say I'm the spitting image of my old man." He really started shooting the questions at me to stop him. I said, "Sir, could I please have the sandwich and the rest of the red pop before I answer any more questions?" He slapped his forehead and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Bud. I was so surprised about who you are and so happy that you didn't drive off that I forgot about our deal." He handed me the sandwich and the pop and the apple. I was so hungry that I forgot all about scraping the mustard off the bologna sandwich. And even like that, it was the best sandwich I'd ever had in my life. "Bud," he said, "my name's Mr. Lewis. Now, if you were about 15, 20 years older, you could call me Lefty. But you're not, so you can't. Mr. Lewis will do just fine. I shoved the part of my sandwich that I was chewing to the side of my mouth so I could say, "Yes, sir, Mr. Lewis, sir." He said, "I'm not ashamed to admit, but you gave me quite a scare here tonight that I'll never forget. I just know I'll be having nightmares about meeting you for the rest of my life. I'll wake up in a cold sweat many a night with the picture of you in my car pulling away with that blood on the seat. I can see it all now. I'll be sound asleep deep in the middle of the Dorothy Dandridge dream when all of a sudden I'll be standing at the side of the road in Owasso, Michigan at 2:30 in the morning, and I'll be seeing my car and that blood pulling away with nothing of you showing but that little peanut head of yours peeking over the dash." He looked at me out of the side of his eye. "Anyone ever tell you got a little peanut head?" I glugged down the pop I'd been swishing around in my mouth and said, "No, sir." "Well," he said, "this may be the first time, but unless you undergo some major surgery, I bet it won't be the last." "Yes, sir." He waited for a second and then sounded kind of disappointed when he said, "Don't take it too seriously, Bud. I am teasing you, you know." I started in on the apple. "Yes, sir." "Ever been in the Army, Bud?" "No, sir." "Well, I've got to tell you, I haven't heard so many sirs since I was back at Fort Gordon in Georgia training before the big war." I almost said "yes, sir," but I looked at him and guessed he was still teasing. I took another drink of the red pop and saw that when I was raising the bottle, I had accidentally let some of the sandwich slip out of my mouth and down into the pop. There were a couple of chunks of chewed bread and a blob of bologna and some of the mustard swimming around in the bottle. The mustard was real pretty. It looked like it was kind of a magical fog. Every time I moved the bottle, the mustardy smoke went into a different kind of shape. Lefty Lewis said, "How about sharing that pop, Bud?" Uh-oh. He took one look and handed it back. He said, "Nothing personal, Bud, but I've raised 3 kids and I have 2 grandkids. I've learned the hard way about drinking after young folks. But I do believe you need to get in and see a doctor soon. It looks to me like you got some serious backwash problem. That's the most food I've ever seen floating around in a bottle of pop. In fact, that doesn't look like red pop anymore. It looks more like red stew." I, real quick, chugged the rest of the pop down and ate the apple real slow because I figured as soon as I was done with it, the questions would start up again. Lefty Lewis said, "Aren't you sleepy?" Now this was perfect. I could pretend I was falling asleep and then come up with some answers. That would get me to Grand Rapids for sure. I yawned real big. "A little bit, sir." "All right, here. Give me that. All right. Here, give me that core. I think the only thing that's left is a seed or 2 anyway." I handed him the apple core and he put it in wax paper from the sandwich in the paper bag. "You just stretch out here and have some sleep. In about an hour, you'll be in a nice, comfortable bed. We can have our talk in the morning." He reached in the back seat and said, "Here," and handed me a jacket. "You can use it for a blanket." The jacket smelled real good, like spice and soap. Lefty Lewis said, "Oh, Bud Not Buddy, one more thing before you doze off. Could you reach over into my box and hand me one of those bottles of blood? I haven't had a bite to eat all day." I kept my eyes closed and smiled. I knew I was going to be safe because I never heard of a vampire that could drive a car, and I'd never seen one that had such a good sense of humor. Besides, I kept my jackknife open under my leg, and he looked like he believed me when I told him it was made out of real silver, even though it probably wasn't. As soon as I had the jacket over me, the smell of spice and soap and the sound of crickets and toady frogs outside made my eyes get real heavy. Wow, I must have been real tired. Walking and ducking in and out of bushes between Flint and Owasso was a lot more work than I thought it was. Most of the time since Mom had died, if someone even walked close to where I was sleeping, I was up in a flash. My eyes fly open, and I'm looking right at them. One of the foster homes where I'd stayed, a woman told me that she knew I was going to be a criminal because anyone who sleeps that light has got to have a guilty conscience. Most of the time, the sound of someone breathing in the same room as me was enough to get me up. But this morning I felt like I was at the bottom of the well that someone had filled with a ton of thick chocolate pudding. Someone was calling my name from way up at the top of the well, and she was saying, "Bud, Bud, Bud." Waves from the pudding were slogging me back and forth and back and forth. "Bud, wake up, Bud." It was a woman's voice, and her hands